Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now let's dive into the stories.
Silence in the office had a peculiar, almost tangible taste when the clock passed 10 in the evening. Usually, there was always some noise: printers, voices of colleagues, phone calls, the rustling of keyboards. But now, dead silence. Only occasionally, a faint creak echoed from the hallway, as if old doors were slowly closing by themselves. Sarah lifted her eyes from the monitor and sighed. Just a little longer, and it's done, she reassured herself, though she knew she was barely holding herself up. The work was draining, and the vacation was her only consolation. She knew that if she didn't finish the report tonight, Mr. Holden, the director, would surely find a reason to delay her weekend. Her desk was closer to the window, from which she could see the dark streets. Under the lamp, the keyboard seemed yellowish, as if squeezed out from the same dim light. Sarah absent-mindedly bit her lip, staring at the text on the screen. Her tired eyes moved across the lines, but every word seemed the same. Beyond the office, the darkness. After work hours, the office quickly transformed into a place where it wasn't wise to stay too long. But she wasn't alone. Somewhere deep within the building, the janitor was working. From time to time, the sounds of a bucket sliding across the floor or the faint noise of a mop could be heard. Sarah only knew him as Old Henry, an elderly man with wrinkled hands who always muttered something under his breath. The last one remaining was the director. His office was at the end of the hallway, and the door was ajar. Faint light spilled out. He always worked late, hardly ever leaving. Sarah glanced at the clock, 10:17 p.m. The beginning click. The light in the hallway went out. Sarah jolted, feeling a shiver run down her spine. She glanced into the darkness. The silhouettes of furniture seemed blurred, indistinct. Maybe the janitor just turned off the light. She pressed the save key and pushed her chair back. Standing up, she slowly walked toward the door and peeked into the hallway. Henry. No response. She took a step forward. The entire floor had plunged into pitch darkness, except for a small island of light coming from the director's office. She hesitated. Should she ask him? Or just turn back and finish the work? Suddenly, something slid in the darkness. Not a sound, not a movement, just a slight sensation, as if the space around her had changed. If it weren't for her own breathing, she would have thought she was the only one in the entire building. Something cracked behind her. Sarah whipped around. There was only darkness. Her fingers tightened into a fist. Henry, is that you? Silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, a soft whisper came from Mr. Holden's office. It was so quiet that it was hard to tell whether it was a real sound or just her tired mind starting to invent things. You're not alone. Sarah froze. The feeling that someone was standing right next to her was so real that she wanted to turn around once more. But she couldn't. The cold that ran down her spine made her legs feel like jelly. The light in the director's office abruptly went out. Sarah felt her body start to retreat. She slowly turned back toward her office, trying not to make a single unnecessary sound. But as soon as she took the first step, something cracked in the darkness. And this time, it was closer. Sarah felt the air in the hallway grow denser, heavier. She took a step back, barely able to breathe. Another crack. It was right next to her. Sarah bolted back into her office and quickly shut the door. Just as she caught her breath, she remembered, the door didn't lock. She yanked open a drawer, desperately searching for anything to block the way. Another whisper. Now it was right by the door. Sarah froze, feeling panic spreading throughout her body. You're not alone. The words weren't spoken aloud, they seemed to echo directly in her mind. Suddenly, something clicked. The computer monitor went black, then flickered back on. An empty chat window opened on the screen. Do you see me? Sarah's heart clenched. She stood still, then, almost involuntarily, began typing. Who are you? A pause. Then a new message appeared: "Open the door." Sarah recoiled from the desk. She wanted to leap out of the window, but she knew it wouldn't open. The office was on the 4th floor. Then she remembered the janitor. Steeling herself, she crept up to the door and pressed her ear against the wood. Silence. Carefully, she turned the handle, inching the door open just a few centimeters, and peered out. The hallway was empty. Neither Henry nor Mr. Holden. Just the darkness, which seemed thicker than before. Sarah slid forward, moving along the wall. She had to find someone. As she passed by the director's office, she peeked inside. It was dark, but the chair at the desk was turned toward the window. Mr. Holden. No response. Sarah took another step. The chair slowly began to turn. It was empty. Something quietly laughed in the darkness behind her. Sarah spun around, but there was no one there. But the door at the end of the hallway, leading to the cleaning closet, was now ajar. And from there, a faint light was spilling out. Climax with trembling fingers, Sarah touched the door and slowly opened it wider. Inside stood Henry. But something was wrong. His face was hidden in the shadow, but he stood motionless, staring down at the floor. "Henry." The old man didn't respond. Sarah took a step closer, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. And then she noticed his hands. They were clutching a wet rag in a death grip, but his skin was strange. It looked peeled. Henry slowly raised his head. And for the first time since she'd entered the room, he spoke. "He sees you." A wave of cold swept over Sarah, chilling her to the bone. Something began to move behind her. The darkness behind her grew thicker, denser. Something was there. She felt a touch on her shoulder. She turned around. And saw it. Sarah saw herself. But not in a reflection. Right in front of her stood a figure, tall, with strangely distorted facial features, as if blurred, like an old photograph that had melted from water. But the most terrifying part was the eyes. They were empty, black, like a deep well. Sarah took a step back, but couldn't tear her gaze away. The figure slowly tilted its head, mimicking her own movements. Henry silently watched, motionless. His lips trembled, but he said nothing. The darkness behind the figure stirred as if it were alive. "What is this?" Sarah croaked, but her voice faltered. The figure leaned closer, its black eyes piercing Sarah. "You've been here before," it whispered in her own voice. Sarah recoiled, stumbling, and hitting something hard. Mr. Holden's chair. She quickly turned around, it was once again facing the window. But now, Mr. Holden was sitting in it. His neck was unnaturally twisted, his mouth open in a silent scream. His eyes were wide and unblinking. Sarah froze. "It's a dream, it's just a dream," she whispered, clutching her head in her hands. The figure moved even closer. "You've already woken up." Sarah felt something tightening around her throat. The air became heavy, unbearable. And then she remembered. The dark water. The bloody stains on the office floor. Her own body, lying among the scattered papers. It had happened before. She had stayed late in the office before. She had seen that face before. She had never left the office that night. The figure bent closer to her ear. "Remember." And Sarah remembered. How her body had been found in the morning. How people wondered why the security cameras hadn't recorded anything. How Henry, who had worked here for 20 years, simply disappeared one day. How Mr. Holden spoke to someone in his office when he was alone. How everyone had forgotten what had happened. Sarah looked around. The office no longer looked real. The walls dissolved into darkness. Henry stood with his head down, his body slowly vanishing. Mr. Holden remained still, and his eyes finally moved. The figure in front of her blurred, taking on her own appearance. And Sarah stood there, realizing she would never be able to leave. Because she had already stayed here. Epilogue: the next morning, the office was once again filled with employees. Mr. Holden's office door was open, the chair neatly pushed under the desk. The janitor, a new, young guy who had replaced old Henry, wiped the dust and continued working. No one remembered Sarah. No one remembered anyone who had worked there before. But from time to time, when people stayed late in the office, the computer monitor suddenly flickered. And on the screen appeared a single message. "Do you see me?" Stella always worked late. Cleaning the office after the workday had become a routine for her, arranging chairs, wiping down tables, collecting trash. The silence after the chaos of the day was even calming. But tonight, something was off. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly on the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows. The air in the corridors carried the still scent of coffee and paper, mixed with a barely noticeable humidity. Stella slid the rag across the cold floor and sighed quietly. The office was almost empty. Almost. Every time she walked past the long hallway near the archive department, it seemed like she could hear quiet footsteps behind her. A switch clicked somewhere. She froze, holding her breath. She turned around, empty. Just old furniture, scattered boxes, and the dark void of the open storage room door. Just exhaustion, she thought, wiping cold sweat from her forehead. But as she walked a little further, she felt like someone was watching her from the darkness of the storage room. The beginning a loud sound behind her made her jump. Something heavy thudded onto the floor in the archive department. Stella slowly turned, her breathing quickened. "Is someone here?" she asked, trying to hide the tremble in her voice. No answer. The light at the end of the corridor suddenly went out. Her heart raced. She cautiously moved forward, gripping the mop handle as though it were a weapon. She knew this office, every corner, every scratch on the furniture. But now, it felt foreign, hostile. She looked up and saw him. Behind the glass doors of the archive room stood a silhouette. Stella froze, her fingers gripping the cold mop handle. Her body refused to move. The silhouette didn't stir, it just stood there, motionless, in the darkness. The light flickered suddenly. The silhouette disappeared. Stella took a step back, feeling her legs turn to jelly. She couldn't stay here. She had to leave. But the door to the corridor was already shut. Behind her, she heard breathing. Stella spun around abruptly, holding the mop handle out in front of her as if it could be any sort of weapon. But the hallway was empty. Only her own heavy, erratic breathing filled the space. Calm down, she thought, trying to steady herself. It could just be a play of light, a reflection in the glass. But deep down, a chilling thought began to form: she wasn't alone. Stella slowly moved toward the exit. Her sneakers squeaked faintly on the linoleum. She reached the door, grabbed the handle. And realized it was locked. "No, no, no," she muttered, tugging at the door harder. Her keys were in the cleaning supply closet, 2 hallways away. Something crashed in another part of the office. Her heart leaped into her throat. This wasn't the sound of a box falling or a draft of air. It was a loud thud. Like someone had struck metal with all their might. She remembered her phone. She pulled it from her pocket, her fingers barely obeying. She turned on the screen. No signal. Another dull thud. Closer. Stella felt her blood run cold. She had to find the keys. She had to get out of here. She moved forward, trying not to run, so as not to draw attention, though she had no idea to whom. The lights in the hallway went out. For a moment, there was complete darkness. Then they flickered back on, but not fully. The bulbs blinked, casting jagged shadows. And in one of them, she saw him. A man stood at the end of the hallway. Tall, motionless. His face was lost in the darkness, but Stella could feel his gaze. He slowly tilted his head to the side. She turned and ran. The climax: Stella raced down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the empty office. She didn't look back, because she knew he was there. She burst into the supply closet, slammed the door shut, and gasped for air. With trembling hands, she began rummaging through the drawer of rags and cleaning supplies. Where were the keys? Her eyes scanned the dark room. The mirror on the wall reflected her terrified face, wide eyes. And behind her, movement. In the reflection of the mirror, he appeared. Tall. In dark clothes. His hand reached out toward her. Stella screamed and spun around. Empty. But the closet door was ajar. She wasn't alone anymore. Breathing heavily, she burst out of the room, clutching the keys in her hand. She had to reach the exit. The hallway seemed endless. The lights flickered. She ran, but something was wrong. The footsteps behind her. They weren't normal. They mimicked her own. When she stopped, they stopped too. When she took a step, they repeated it. She couldn't take it anymore. Stella lunged forward to the door. She slid the key into the lock. But her hand froze. Her reflection in the glass doors. It didn't mirror her movements. It stared at her. And smiled. Stella froze, her fingers desperately trying to turn the key, but she couldn't anymore. Her body felt heavy, like stone, and cold sweat ran down her back. The reflection in the door smiled, but not like she did. The smile was cold, merciless, and she felt as though that gaze was penetrating the very essence of her being. Her heart was pounding wildly, loudly, and everything around her seemed unreal, like a bad dream. She turned around, but saw no one. The corridor was empty, just like the closet behind her. Yet, his presence was palpable, as if something dark and sinister was nearby, watching her. And then, suddenly, like an explosion, her awareness snapped. Her hand was still holding the key, but along with it, another cold piece of metal was in her fingers, another key, identical, except for the clearly carved symbol on it, resembling an ancient mark. At that moment, she heard a barely audible whisper behind her. It was so quiet, yet clear, like a bell. "You can't leave, Stella." She didn't turn around. Her whole being screamed for her to run, to get out of this place, but something inside her held her back. No, this couldn't be real. It was just her imagination. But the look in the door said otherwise. The footsteps behind her finally became distinct, as if they were getting closer. The whisper continued, and Stella knew this wasn't just sound. It was the same man who had appeared in the darkness. The one who had been watching her in the corridor. He was here. He wasn't just in her reflection, he was in the very space of this building, in every shadow, in every scar on the walls. And his eyes were watching. In that moment, she understood there was no more choice. She turned around and saw him right in front of her. Tall, dark, with a face she recognized but couldn't place. He simply stood there. He was silent, and the darkness around him began to close in, as if it wanted to swallow the entire world. "You won't be able to leave," he said, his voice soft but cold, like metal. Stella screamed. She didn't know what to do. Maybe it was her mind losing control, or maybe it was something real that shouldn't be here. But she knew she couldn't leave until she understood what this nightmare was. Her steps grew heavier. The light flickered out completely, and the darkness consumed everything, like a thick fog. Drenched in that fog, Stella felt she no longer controlled her body. The shadows wrapped around her like hands and pulled her in. In the last moment before the darkness swallowed her, she remembered. Her first feeling had been true, she wasn't alone here.